All right, it looks like everybody has joined us so far. Thank you very much for joining, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Jennifer Pline, the head of wealth management at Cambridge Trust, and thank you for joining this session to discuss charting a course for your family's philanthropy. The session is being recorded and we will post it on our website later this week. First, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Teresa Ellis, who is the founder and CEO of Liminality Partners, a philanthropic coaching and advising practice. Teresa is also a philanthropist who works with families and individuals to help them find joy in their giving while creating greater impact. Teresa started at a very young age with her philanthropy by founding Teresa's Lemonade and Cookies, because of course there is more profit to be made by diversifying your smile-laden offerings. And Teresa has always taken an entrepreneurial approach to problem solving. Joining us also is my colleague, Erin Cooper, who is a relationship manager at Cambridge Trust. Erin works with families and nonprofit organizations to help them achieve their long-term goals. Erin is a chartered advisor in philanthropy and already formed one nonprofit, and I should say when she had very young children, Kid Kindness, which focused on getting young children involved in philanthropy by developing community service projects that are both educational and fun. And it was a true testament to the fact that you're really never too young to make a difference. So our format today will be that I'll make a few comments and then I will turn it over to Teresa to make her presentation. And then Erin, Teresa, and I will take questions. We expect the session to last about an hour, and I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A section as they come to you. So as we get started, I thought I would define philanthropy, which is the desire to promote the welfare of others, expressed especially by the generous donation of money to good causes. And many of us tend to use philanthropy and charity interchangeably, but they really are different. The idea with charity is to relieve the pain, and with philanthropy, we're attempting to address some of the root causes of the problem. And the US is really quite unique in the amount of philanthropy that we have. And philanthropy funds many, many important causes that in other countries might be funded by the government. And certainly there are pros and cons to either way of doing things. But certainly in the US, our tax system also enables giving because of the tax deductibility of charitable giving. A little more history. Again, I was doing a little Googling a couple of days ago, and there was a comment that it's widely acknowledged that George Peabody in the 1700s was the father of modern philanthropy. But as with everything, there also was likely a mother of philanthropy who may not have gone down in history quite as much. But in the early days, married women often supported organizations that their husbands gave to, as well as giving generously of their time. That changed pretty dramatically in the last 40 to 50 years as women have worked more outside the home and have wanted to support organizations in their own right. Margaret Olivia Slocum Sage, who was born in the early 1800s, was an early American philanthropist known for her contributions to education and progressive causes. She married Robert Baron Russell Sage in 1869, and when he died, she inherited $63 million, which was a princely sum at the time. And not surprisingly, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Russell Sage Foundation and Russell Sage College, which was founded in 1916. Again, interestingly, using her husband's name at that time. Young people have also started to have more of an impact on giving. And in recent years, I would say the trend in philanthropy, and it will be interesting to hear this from Teresa as well, people are focused a little bit more on what the return on investment is in their philanthropy, and metrics have become so much more important as people fund causes. And as you'll hear from Teresa, there have been significant growth in consultants who assist families in advising on their philanthropy. I'm now going to turn the session over to Teresa. And again, as we do that, reminder to please use the Q&A section to ask any questions you may have. Teresa, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Jennifer, for the warm welcome, and to Erin, too, for having me today. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. I will confess that when I got up this morning and knew I was going to be with you, I had to think for a minute about not coming to work in a t-shirt, because it's been so long since I've been in a group of folks where there's been a more formal get together. So this is really such a pleasure for so many reasons. As Jennifer said, I run Liminality Partners, which is a philanthropic advising practice. We work with families who are interested in giving in ways that really allow them to have more impact. And what I want to talk to you today about is what we often find in families who are on that journey. And I would say our experience is ours, but also shared by what we've seen in conversations with others who work with families, and also in the research, and how you move as an individual who's interested in philanthropy from a place of feeling stuck and sort of, I wonder why this isn't working, to feeling like you're really giving in a way that allows the joy that hopefully is present in philanthropy to shine through in what you're doing. So we want to talk a little bit about how you do that, and then share some resources with all of you for really getting to impact in your giving, and finding those organizations that allow you to feel that experience of both joy and impact when you're giving. So I'm going to share my screen with all of you and just go through a few PowerPoint slides, and then I'm really excited to have time for questions at the end. Though if you're going through and you have a clarifying question as we're going through, please do ask it, because I don't want anyone to be wondering about something. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so when you're giving, what stands in the way? We often meet families when they're at a moment of feeling a little bit stuck. And we've seen pretty consistently that there are a couple of things that typically cause that feeling of stuck. So here are just a sampling of those. I would say very often there's a feeling of overwhelm, and I'm afraid I'm going to get it wrong. Folks feel real obligation, sincere, earnest obligation to do good things with the money that they've earned or that they've inherited. And they often wonder, gee, what if I make a bad choice? What if I get this wrong? What if I give to the wrong organization? Or which organization is the right organization, given the many, many organizations that are doing great things for the environment, or for young people, or for elderly folks? They're not sure where to start. I would say we also bump into situations where we have disagreements either between partners or among family members. And part of the work is to help figure out how we thread that needle. And we spend a lot of time navigating those family dynamics and helping people really come to consensus about how they move things forward. And then I would say there's also a real thread, and we haven't bumped into this as much, but other colleagues in my field have, who say, I just don't have time to give, or I'll give when I'm less busy, or I'll give when I've sold my company, or I'll give when my kids get older. There's a sense of this isn't the right moment. And if I wait for some moment in the future, then that'll be the right time for me to engage in philanthropy. And all of this, I would say, manifests in this feeling of hesitancy around philanthropy, feeling of stuckness, feeling of this isn't the moment where I should be stepping into this, even as we know that the problems in the world mostly, not exclusively, but mostly are getting bigger. And the need for people to bring their resources, and we're going to talk a little bit about what kind of resources to bear on these problems, are at an all-time high in a lot of ways. So where do you start? There's a big world of nonprofits here in the United States. There's 1.5 million nonprofit organizations. That's a lot of organizations to sift through. And when you've got all these feelings of stuckness, where do you begin? So we find in work with families, almost always, they want to start with, what do I want to support? I'm really interested in the environment. I'm really interested in education. I had a teacher who was influential as a mentor, and I want to support mentoring organizations. And while all of that is hugely important, almost always when a family has started there with the question of what do you want to support, we find there's something that gets in the way. And universally, it's been true that what gets in the way of answering the what question effectively, well, in a way that moves the family forward, is going back a layer to understanding why are you giving in the first place. And so when we're working with families, that's always where we start. And let me tell you a little bit about a little story about a family that we worked with that I think illustrates this point. This is a family that we've been working with now for almost 8 years. When we met them, the mom, who is the daughter of the wealth creator, her father started a company that he sold a while ago now, and that generated the family's wealth, about 30 million of which is sitting in a family foundation. I met this woman when both her parents had passed away, maybe a year and a half or 2 years before I started working with her. And she was at a point where she wanted to bring her daughters into the work of the family foundation. They were excited. They knew about the work of the family's philanthropy, and they were eager to participate. And they had started the conversation around what is it that the girls want to give money to. That was the conversation that they were having when I met them. And I would say that while the girls were excited to be involved, they also weren't fully engaged as trustees. They would sometimes come to the meetings. They would sometimes not come to the meetings. They would sometimes have read proposals. They would sometimes not have read proposals. And it was kind of jerky, the way that they were engaging in the work of the family philanthropy. So when I met them, that's where they were. And we started by taking a step back and really spending time having the mom talk about why it was that grandma and grandpa had been involved in philanthropy in the first place. And what was it about philanthropy that was important to their family, important enough that they would set aside this money in a family foundation and a private foundation to be there in perpetuity. And she spent time telling stories about what was important to her parents. The girls spent time engaging with those stories and talking about, oh, I remember when grandma and grandpa talked about that. I remember why that was important to us as children. And all of a sudden, the engagement with the work of the family foundation shifted in a very palpable way and became grounded in those things that were most fundamental to that family, most important, the things that animated why they made this choice in the first place. And then from there, they were able to start to talk about, well, what would they give to that would really animate that sense of purpose in this family? And over time, as there have been disagreements, as there always are in families, or I shouldn't say always, but I haven't met a family that hasn't had a disagreement yet. When those moments have arisen, they've been able to go back to those values and say, well, this is really what's most important. And maybe we should use that as a lens for driving how we make decisions going forward. So as I said, we always think about starting with the question of why folks are engaged in philanthropy in the first place. And then from there, everything else tends to follow. So how do you do that? It's a tricky question. Some people know the answer to it right away, but some people don't. So there are a range of ways that you can get at this question about what your why is. And these are a few that we use in our work that I just wanted to share with you as you in your own families might be having this conversation. Lots of you probably know Brene Brown. She's a prolific author. She writes about, among other things, vulnerability. I love her work. I've read just about every book that she's written. But this book on the screen, Dare to Lead, is a wonderful tool as you're thinking about this question. And in there, if you Google Dare to Lead values, on her website, it'll pull up 2 pages, I think, of values that she's identified that animate people's work. And you can use that as a prompt to go through and think about the values that animate your own philanthropy and to have a conversation with your family about the values that animate your philanthropy. Another great resource is Simon Sinek's. He's the fellow holding the book that says Start with Why. His TED Talk, which is called Start with Why, is a great resource for people who prefer to watch something. It's a wonderful way to engage with the question about why the question of why matters. He talks about that a little bit here, where he says people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. That's really the same thing for philanthropy. And his discussion about why, the question of why matters, is a great conversation starter to get you going about what it is that animates your why. And then the last thing I would offer, and this one is you have to buy it, but it's a great resource also. The little blue cards at the bottom of the slide are the motivational values tools that our colleagues at 2164 have developed. And on each card, there is a value and then a definition of that value. And these are loads of fun to pull out at a family gathering, to give everybody a copy of their own motivational values, have them sort through the cards, identify the values that are most interesting to them, and then discuss them. And it's a really wonderful way, in sort of more of a hands-on fashion, to start a conversation about what matters to you as a family and why those values are important to you as a family. So those are a couple of tools that we would offer about how to start to have that conversation about what matters to you. And we really think having everybody get clear on their own values, and then in turn having that conversation as a group, so that you're coming together with a clear understanding of what matters to me, so that I can bring that forward into what matters to us, is really the right way to begin this conversation about why. So for us, that's foundational. We start with the question of why, and then we get into the question of, well, what do you want to give to? So this visual really gets at the question of where do you start and how do you build through the question of impact. As I said, and as we've just been talking about, we really do start with this question of why. And so that notion of I've articulated my values, I know what matters to me, is where we start these discussions, where we start this foundational work of understanding what animates your philanthropy. And then from there, we talk about, well, what is it that brings you joy? So there's some really wonderful research that gets at the question of joy and happiness. And one of the theses in that research is that getting clear about your values and then working in alignment with those values brings deeper meaning, brings deeper satisfaction, and allows for less sort of sucking of energy, right? That feeling that you have when you're doing something and you feel like, oh, this is just so hard, right? That happens when there's misalignment between your values and the thing that you're doing. So understanding what those things are that bring you joy is the next step, but you can't do that until you know what your values are. And then from there, we talk about something called limiting obligatory giving. This is a concept that comes out of a really wonderful book called Inspired Philanthropy. And it really gets at this notion of the giving that we do because a friend asks us to do. You know, my mom is walking in the Susan G. Komen race for breast cancer, which we wouldn't be doing right now, but in normal times. And I feel like I want to write her a check because of that. You might be glad to do it. It might be important to you because of your relationship with your mom, but it isn't the thing that really brings you joy. It's something you're doing because you feel a sense of connection to, a sense of obligation to, in a positive sense, another person. It might be obligation that you also feel that isn't so positive, right? My coworker asked me to sponsor, their kids' drive for the local food bank, and I feel like I have to. Again, sense of obligation, but not really in alignment with your values, not really out of a sense of joy. I will say there's no sense in all of this of judgment. Our values are personal. And so what brings me joy might be quite different than what brings someone else joy, but it's really in finding that moment of alignment and being able to say comfortably no to the things that are not in alignment, that are out of obligation. And in turn, creating more space for the things that bring you joy to come into that. I see a question. Let's see. So there's a question that says, does Cambridge Trust conduct due diligence or have a way to vet nonprofits to help with identifying those that are highest impact? If so, which metrics are commonly used? Measures like impact multiple of money or other criteria? Thanks. That's a great question. And let's put a pin in that and come back to it in just a minute if we can. So that question about limiting obligatory giving is a really important step. And then from there, we really think you can get into the question of how you really understand impact on the nonprofit, impact on a social issue or social cause, and getting to the kind of impact that people really talk about when they say impact. So how do you do this? Where do you start? Sorry about that. There we go. So we use something called the Giving Inventory. It's a tool that we've developed at Liminality to help people really understand how to move from I've got my values defined to getting to the question of impact. We have a tool that we use. I'd be happy to share it with you if you're interested, but this is basically the steps that you take. So first, you list all of the organizations that you support, and you need to include organizations that you give your time to, your talents to, your treasure to, and your influence to. And those may or may not be the same organizations. You may be writing checks to some organizations and volunteering at others, and you want to capture that whole universe. You want to also capture everything you're doing at an organization. So if you're giving both time and treasure and talent, get all of that. Then what you're going to go through is go through that list of organizations and really reflect on, is this an organization that when I work with them, I find joy? Does it feel in alignment with my values? Does it make me feel like I'm in alignment with the things that feel most important to me, most fundamental to me, animate the way I want to live my life? And what's interesting when people go through this exercise is that sometimes the organization brings them joy, working with the organization does, but a certain activity that they're doing that or at that organization does not. And so going through and doing this inventory and then making a plan to really exit or limit or constrain your engagement with organizations that doesn't feel in alignment, that doesn't bring you joy, hugely important step. And when you do that, you're then freeing up time to really give time and talent and treasure to give to those organizations where you find that moment of satisfaction, that moment of aha, that moment of this feels so great. So those are the questions that we really ask you to go through. Are these activities that bring you joy? Are these things that feel like honored obligations? Again, that gift that I need to give because my mom asked or my sister asked or my coworker asked. Or does it feel like it's something that's social giving? I need to do it because it's part of my kids' school community or it's part of my neighborhood community. And really making sure that if those are honored obligations or social giving, you limit those as much as you feel comfortable to create space for the other things to come into your philanthropic portfolio, if you will. So once you've done that, you can then really get to this question of impact. And this is what Jennifer was talking about, sort of in the notion of metrics and the importance of metrics and the move toward better or call for greater accountability, call for greater engagement with understanding what the ROI is, understanding what's happening as a result of the work the nonprofit organization is doing. What we've seen in the course of our work is that lots of folks talk about impact, but there are a whole range of ways you get at the question of impact, and we like to really help people put some parameters around that. So when you look at this pyramid, what you see are the different levels of impact that an organization, or the different ways that an organization might express its impact. The things below the green line, operational foundation and program delivery, and organizational effectiveness, those first two layers of the pyramid, are really things that we think about as table stakes. These are things that organizations ought to be doing if they're operating. And we're going to come back to talk about what those qualities are in just a minute. But then above that green line, there are things that are gradations of how impact gets expressed. And I want to say just a few words about what that looks like. So outputs, this is what most nonprofit organizations capture. These are the activities that they are doing as a nonprofit organization that support the result they're trying to get. This is the number of hours an adult has read to a child in a literacy program, or the number of hours an adult has spent mentoring a young person in a mentoring program, or the pounds of food the food bank has collected to distribute to folks who are food insecure in a particular neighborhood, or the number of visits that a museum has had to see a certain collection. Those are outputs. Sort of, it's the counting of activities that happen in a nonprofit organization. You need the outputs to get to the outcomes. The outcomes are really the results and what changes as a result of the work that the organization is doing. That's where you really begin to get into this question of, is the work of the organization beginning to move the needle on a societal challenge that we're grappling with? So there's a strong relationship. Outputs are foundational for outcomes, but a lot of organizations are still really grappling with how to get at the question of outcomes and understanding that there's lots of things that are pushing on the outcome. It's not just necessarily the work of that one organization. There's probably a confluence of things that are happening that really help the folks being served by the organization get where they're going. And then sort of stacked on top of that, you have third-party evaluation, which is an outside evaluator looking at the outcomes of an organization and verifying that they're valid, that they've been obtained in the right way in a sort of scientifically defensible fashion. And then sitting at the top of that, sort of at the very tippy top of the impact pyramid, is something called randomized control trials, where you're looking at sort of control groups to see if the intervention from a particular nonprofit is getting to a materially different outcome than that same organization, than a group of people who aren't getting that same intervention. That's a hugely complicated endeavor and very expensive endeavor. And I think we would say when we're working with most families, unless you're on par with the Gates Foundation or the Ford Foundation, asking for third-party evaluation or randomized control trials, almost always unreasonable, very expensive to do, very time intensive to do. And really what you're looking at is, are organizations getting to outcomes? Can you make a discernible difference between outputs and outcomes, and what's driving those outcomes? So that's a little bit about the layers of impact when we talk about impact in nonprofit organizations. And I just want to go back, as I said, to these foundational pieces around organizational effectiveness and operational foundation. Like we said, we think about those really as table stakes. Organizations should be doing those things in a manner, of course, in just the regular course of their operations. And there's really 6 things that we look for in organizations to make sure they're doing that. This is the due diligence that we do on behalf of the families that we work for. I think it gets to the question that Beth posed about, how do you screen organizations? So let me just share those with you and a little bit about what we're looking for when we ask these questions. So the first is, does the organization have a clear articulation of what they're hoping to see change in the world? This might be something like, we want every child in foster care to have a caring adult in their life. That's a change that they might like to see in the world, because as it stands right now, every kid in foster care doesn't have that. So have they clearly articulated what that change is that they want to see in the world? The second thing we're interested in is, do the programs that they run align in a way that moves toward that change? So this same organization might run a program to go out and recruit adults in corporate America to serve as mentors to these young people in foster care. That's a program that they run that supports that change they're looking to see, that every child in foster care have a caring adult. So you can see the connection between the activity that they're doing in the program and what they're trying to affect longer term in the work of their organization. That's the second piece. The third quality that we look for is the leadership. So does the leadership possess the qualities that they need in terms of their management ability, in terms of their understanding of financial structures, in terms of their relationship to and partnership with the community that they might be working with? That's a hugely important one. Do they have the leadership characteristics that they need in order to advance the work of the organization? That's the third question that we ask. The fourth question that we ask is, are they gathering information to assess their impact? And are they gathering that information from a range of sources? So to go back to the example we're using of the foster care organization, do they ask the people that they've been in touch with, the adults that they've been reaching out to, like, what kind of information are they gathering about them, about their work towards meeting their goal? What kind of information are they gathering from the young people in the program, the kids who are in foster care? What about information from the staff that they work with? So what are the inputs that they're gathering to understand the kind of outcomes that they're working towards achieving? And then the final two questions are around the financial health of the organization. So the first question is, do they have a viable financial model? So it's a little bit of a misnomer in the nonprofit sector that nonprofits don't need to make money. They do. In order to stay in business, they need to be running not a deficit, but a surplus, and having some amount of cushion so that when there are lumpy moments in their cash flow cycle, they have the cash on hand that they need to weather those moments. So how do they secure funds to support the work of the organization? Is their financial model viable? That might be a straight fundraising model. They might raise money from donors and then spend that money on their program services. That's a viable model, but how does it work? Understanding that and making sure that it's viable. And then the second question is, are they financially healthy? So in nonprofit world, that means you want to see organizations that on balance are not running deficits year over year, and on balance have sufficient cash in their bank account to support the operation of the organization over the course of a 12-month cycle. You might see some dips and some ebbs and flows in that, but you want to make sure that they're not at a point in the course of the year where they're running negative, so negatively from a cash perspective that they can't meet their obligations as an organization. And that will change, obviously, as the organization grows. Smaller organizations are more susceptible to cash flow bumps than larger organizations, but that's something you want to be looking for over the course of the organization's life. So those are the 6 things that we look for when we're getting at this question of, are they operationally effective? And then from there, you get into these questions that we were talking about around outputs and outcomes and even more sophisticated forms of evaluation after that. So those are a few tips about how you begin to get into the question, assess the question of impact in an organization. And then once you've done all of that, you have a family who's starting to think about, well, what do I want to support in the first place? And how do I find these organizations? So I wanted to just pull together a few places that you could go looking for ideas about organizations that you might support. Lots of folks tend to fund things that they hear about word of mouth, and word of mouth is powerful. It has a degree of implicit bias built in, right? Because we ask our friends who are somewhat like us in some fashion, and they know organizations that are somewhat like them. And in turn, you aren't able to sort of expand your aperture in terms of what might be happening out in the world to address the need. So these are a few places, and I just wanted to offer up a little bit of context about what you might find at each. And then I'll stop talking and we can have a discussion and take questions. So GuideStar, if you don't know about GuideStar, is a wonderful database of all of the nonprofit organizations in the United States that file 990, which is the IRS's sort of tax return for nonprofits, if you will. It's searchable. You can enter terms and it will spit out results. And then from there, give you information, sometimes some sort of basic information about mission and budget size, but also give you access to a nonprofit's 990, which is, as I said, kind of the IRS tax form for nonprofits. And if you pull that up, it'll share some information about the work of the organization and equally their financials when you're getting into some of that more nitty-gritty due diligence. It's a wonderful resource for finding things geographically, because you can search geographically, and then with kind of an initial first crude cut around mission area. Because again of that search functionality. So it'll give you a pretty long list, but at least it's a place to start and really get the aperture widened so that you can then begin to winnow once you say, well, I know what my values are, I've got my giving limited, and I'm really interested now in working on education. This will give you a nice initial pass of some places you might go looking. I'm also a huge fan of local community foundations. Community foundations are in the business of knowing their local community. These happen to be Boston area community foundations because this is a Boston area group. But the Boston Foundation, obviously, I think most folks know about the Boston Foundation, is an amazing resource about things happening in Boston, but then 3 other more hyper-local community foundations, the Cambridge Community Foundation for Cambridge, the Essex County Community Foundation for folks up north, and the Foundation for Metro West, which is kind of the western suburbs. Also really wonderful resources with staff and folks there who know the nonprofit communities in those areas like the back of their hand. And if you go to them to talk about your interest in backyard growing programs for young people who are interested in learning about farming, they can probably spit out 2 or 3 nonprofits that are doing that work and put you in touch with them so that you can get to know them and get to know the work that they're doing. So just a huge fan, as I said, about community foundations. I wanted to mention a couple of industry publications that highlight really interesting things going on in the sector, specifically the Stanford Social Innovation Review and the Chronicle of Philanthropy. The Stanford Social Innovation Review comes out, it's either 4 or 6 times a year, I can't remember. But in addition to publishing research about things happening in the nonprofit sector and philanthropy, they always profile a handful of nonprofit organizations that are doing really interesting, often quite cutting edge, often quite groundbreaking work in different areas. It's just a wonderful resource of kind of the latest and greatest happening in the field. They like to think of themselves a little bit like the Harvard Business Review for the nonprofit sector. So it's a great tool. They also then host convenings and online gatherings, which are often really interesting if you want to go deeper into a particular topic with a community of like-minded folks. And then the Chronicle of Philanthropy is kind of the trade publication. But again, they tend to highlight really interesting organizations from time to time. They're not geographic specific. So if that's a piece of your giving, it's a little trickier to get at some of that. But they have interesting things going on nationally. And I often find if you start with the organization they've listed, there's a really nifty hack to go to that organization's website and then kind of see who they're linked to, which will often get you back to something that's more local. And we've found a number of really interesting projects that way by just reading what's going on in those trade publications. And then last but not least, I just wanted to put in a plug for the Council on Foundations, which is a big national body of supporting foundations of all shapes and sizes. But they've got an untold number of affinity groups. So just about any interest area that you might have, they probably have an affinity group for. This is just a very small subset. But Environmental Grant Makers is an organization specifically focused for grant makers who are interested in things in the environment. Funders Committee for Civic Participation is, as it suggests, so interested in issues around democracy and things that support civic participation and participation in democratic life in our country. Grant Makers for Education are folks interested in supporting public education. The Neighborhood Funders Group is really interested in sort of community-based efforts and sort of local organizations that are tackling particularly issues around poverty and injustice. The list goes on and on and on. And that link that's in the slides, which I know the good folks at Cambridge Trust Company are going to send out to you later today, will get you to all of the affinity groups. And there's just about an affinity group for anything you might be interested in. So again, that just gives you a sense of the breadth and is a great place to go asking if you have some questions. I find their staff members at these affinity groups are hugely generous with their time and very happy to answer questions. So those are some places to go find new organizations once you've gotten through the question of why you're giving, and then you're thinking about, well, what might you want to give to in the first place? So that's the net of it from me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then we can take questions. I know Jennifer and Aaron are coming back online.
Thank you so much, Teresa. As we begin, I did want to highlight 2 other organizations. One is the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation for our clients in New Hampshire who are with us today. And the other is a smaller organization called the Philanthropy Connection, which is an organization that has active philanthropy for women in smaller nonprofit organizations where you're really sort of digging in to the nonprofit. And Erin, I know you've been involved there. I don't know if you want to say a few words about how that works.
Yeah, so the Philanthropy Connection is a women's giving group. So all members donate a set dollar amount, and then that is granted out at the end of the year. And it's a great way to get to know the many wonderful nonprofits in our area and the work that they're doing. And I found over time, a lot of members have, after a couple of years, have been able to really further define their values and then move forward with their philanthropy in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Erin. And going to the question we had earlier, I think that Teresa answered some of the question, but Erin, as you're counseling people and Teresa, as you talk to people, are there some specific metrics that you like to look at within, say, the financial condition or within grant making, et cetera? Erin, do you want to jump in first?
Sure. So usually when I'm working with someone and we're looking at nonprofits, it's really driven by the philanthropist I'm working with and what they're looking to do and the type of impact they want to have. So a lot of times it's facilitating a conversation with that organization to see if it's the right fit, doing a little groundwork, as Teresa mentioned earlier, looking at the organization's mission, what activities are they doing to meet that mission. And then we'll use GuideStar often to pull up their 990s and look at the financials, where's their funding coming from, and the grant looking to be given, what percentage will that be for the annual revenue? That's an important piece to look at as well for a lot of folks.
That's great. I don't have anything to add.
Great, thank you. So one question, and we're in, most of us New Englanders here, and in many circles, talking about money is maybe a little bit taboo. So how do you begin the conversation with a partner or family member about philanthropy and about family values that should be considered as you're making your gifts?
It's a great question, Jennifer. It's funny, we laugh in my family. My husband's a New Englander. I am not. I was born and raised in the Midwest. So I don't know, Midwesterners may have a different sensibility about these things. But you have to be comfortable talking about this stuff to do what we do any given day. I imagine the same holds true for both of you. I think I found that the families that have these conversations and are able to do that in a way that really moves their work forward come from a place of whoever's starting the conversation, spending some time first getting clear about why they want to have the conversation. Like, what is it that's motivating them? They want to do this with their partner. That feels like something that's important to them. Or they want their kids to be involved. That feels important to them. Or they want to shift the ways they're giving. That feels important to them. So getting that clarity on one's own to start. And then from there, just being really earnest and heartfelt about it. And I think almost never have I seen a family who said, hey, look, my love, I feel like we need to make a shift because of X, Y, or Z, that conversation has eventually, as you work on it over time, fallen on deaf ears, because you're in relationship with people who presumably on some level you care about. And that sense of how do we find that common ground that we share and that connection that we share and the concern for one another that we share. Like, if we build from there, we may not agree on everything, but we've at least had enough sort of shared respect to listen to one another and to begin to find those places of intersection and common ground. So getting clear about your own reason for engaging, and then from there, sort of building on that sense of shared connection.
Yeah, agreed. And it's one of those things that exercising the muscle tends to make it a little easier over time. And I think in particular, talking about charitable giving is such a wonderful thing to do within a family, for sure. Have you seen circumstances where people really aren't aligned on their values and what the outcomes can be?
Yes. I bet there's a follow-up question to that too. What do you do?
You might have some fun vignettes on that one.
Yeah. Yes, we have. So we're working with a family right now who, though I think they're going to get there, it has been a 6-month road to kind of understanding why people come to the table with really different perspectives on things. So this is a family that mom is the inheritor of sort of the wealth that was that came in when the family business was sold. And her husband ran the family business for a lot of years, and they have a very deep and abiding sense of the importance of hard work and sort of a pulling yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. And their grandchildren are becoming involved in the work of the family philanthropy. They're in their early 20s. And they are coming at this from a very strong social justice perspective, which grandma and grandpa don't really share a same appreciation for. And so sort of helping them both be able to listen to each other and understand that underneath that comes a really important sense of values around care for the greater good of the world that they both share, but that it's expressed really differently, has been important. It's been interesting too. We just did a session with them where we had the grandchildren do they did skits for their grandparents over Zoom. This was pretty fun, talking about what each of these words mean to them. And as you watch, the grandparents sort of talk about like, oh, I get it. Like, I get why that's important to you. It's been really interesting to see. And through all of that, a lot of peeling back of layers, but I think there is a kernel in the midst of all of that that is really about a very shared value about engaging with the world and caring for the world, though it gets expressed really differently. So there's another question. Did you see it, Jennifer?
Well, no, I was, yeah, and I actually answered one question privately, but yes, another question. What are ways to move beyond a year-to-year tax-driven philanthropy to a more strategic plan? That's a great question, because I do think we tend to, as you said, we tend to give to the same organizations over and over, and it's sometimes good to step back.
Erin, do you want to start? I know you do a lot of this also.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it comes back to the whole values-driven statement. And it's, if you can come up with a family mission statement, really define your values, you're going to help drive your broader giving. And then it's taking those steps to move in that direction. And it is a process to get there. And I don't know if Teresa, if you want to talk a bit about in your experience, I'd be curious as to your answer, is how do you, as you make that shift, how do you comfortably and confidently say, okay, I'm not going to be doing these little grants that I feel obligated to do?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's interesting. We spend a lot of time on that. It's an amazing, I never thought when I started my practice that so much of my time would be spent helping people say no, but we spend a lot of time helping people say no. It's not fun to say no, right? No one wants to say no. Everyone would rather say yes. And in the process of saying yes, we sometimes yes ourselves into a situation where you're like, oh, all those yeses is not where I want to be. So two answers to the question, or answers to two questions. The question that the participant posed around how do you move from a year-to-year process to something more strategic. I would say one thing that's been really helpful with the families that we work with, many of them have private foundations. And so they have payouts that they have to meet year over year. And that kind of drives an understanding of what the amount of philanthropy is that needs to be done. That said, we do have one family we're working with that has all of their resources sitting in a donor advised fund. And so that's different, right? Because there isn't a mandatory payout. And so you have this pot of money and you're trying to figure out, well, what do you want to do with it? So we figured out with them, and I think you can do this if you're also giving from your checkbook, like, okay, this is, I mean, right from in partnership with your financial planners, like, this is how much we think we want to be giving every year, right? These are the obligations we need to meet. And here's where philanthropy fits into that. And so if you can get to something that looks like over the course of 5 years, let's say, we think we have this much to spend on philanthropy, then what we find is that in that first year, if you can, make your final gifts to those sort of social giving endeavors, those obligatory gifts that you feel like you have to do. And you can say to those organizations, look, we're making some changes in our family's philanthropy. We want to make this gift to you so we don't leave you in a lurch. And this is the last year we're going to be doing it. That's a great way to signal we're not leaving you high and dry, because no one wants the rug pulled out from under them. And we're not going to be supporting this work going forward, or we will, but at a very diminished amount. Then from there, once you've done that foundational work that Erin's referencing, you can begin to build. And what we often find in families is that we like to start in years 2 and 3 with kind of a portfolio where you pick and choose some things that get you excited, right? Let's say you've got $10,000 to give. Maybe you end up giving 4 $2,500 grants that year, and you see what you really like. And you give those grants and you get to know those organizations. And in years 2 and 3, you kind of take stock over the course of those years about what's making you feel that sense of joy, that sense of excitement, that sense of, I want to do more of this. And then we would suggest in years 4 and 5, you further refine that and you say, okay, these are the 2 things that really get me feeling jazzed and where I want to spend both more of my time and more of my treasure. And you move down to 2 $5,000 grants. So you have kind of a funneling effect that's happening where you start a little bit broader at the beginning, give yourself some space, and then you narrow in as you get clearer and clearer about what those things are that you get excited about. The question about no, I mean, I will just say it's hard and it's stinky to do. And once you do it, you'll feel so great. There's a really wonderful book that I often send to my clients called Essentialism by a fellow named Greg McCowan. And it's all about how you get to sort of the thing that really matters. And I feel like it's one of those little bit of pain for so much benefit. But it's hard. It's really hard in the moment. If you need a template for how to say no, we have lots of letters. We'd be glad to share them.
Great. Thank you, Teresa. One other factor that you haven't specifically named in terms of giving and how it can bring joy to you is what's the gratitude that the organization shows to you? And, we all have a need to be thanked, particularly when we have extended ourselves, whether it's financially or with our time, et cetera. And I know personally, the organizations that I feel the best about are the ones that find a way to thank me along the way and to do it in a really meaningful way. Not, sometimes thank yous can sound a little empty, but I think we shouldn't discount that as really an important part of which organizations we give to.
Yeah, no question. It's a great point, Jennifer. There's some really wonderful research on the fundraising side of things, that the primary reason people don't give is because they weren't asked. And the primary reason people don't give again is because they weren't thanked. And you just think, my goodness, right? Like you'd like to think that's what your mother or your father taught you when you were a child, and yet not always the case. So important, so important.
There's a comment here about a movie called The Best of Enemies that concerns racism and is based on actual historic happenings. So thank you for that suggestion, and we will put that in our follow-up email for folks if they want to view that movie as well. One question I get, and maybe this will be our last question, is how much money do you have to have before it makes sense to start a foundation?
A private foundation?
Yes.
Oh my gosh. If you asked 100 people that question, you probably get 100 answers. So with that caveat, I mean, there's no actual technical answer to that question. I will say two things. I am, and boy, I'm saying this publicly for the first time, so I'm going to out myself today. I'm not a huge fan of donor advised funds. I think they make lots of things easier. And for that, I think it's wonderful because making philanthropy easier is a great thing. And so that part of their work, I think, is wonderful. I struggle with the fact that so much money is sitting in donor advised funds and doesn't have to get out the door when there is extraordinary need in the world. And that part is the part that makes it harder for me. Private foundations have an annual payout requirement, and I like that very much. That said, I think, just given the work it takes to maintain a foundation and sort of the make them go, probably you want to have a foundation that's got $1 million sitting in its corpus. I think that's kind of the threshold I would think about before I would think about setting up a foundation. And under that, a donor advised fund is a great vehicle. You can do lots of there's some other interesting vehicles that are more technical I won't get into. But the world needs those gifts. And I would say, whatever the way is that's going to help you get the money into the hands of the people who are doing the work that Jennifer talked about at the beginning, like that's the vehicle you want to use.
So if there were two things that you would suggest people do to get started and to sort of work on any inertia they may have, what would your advice be?
Yep. Spend a little bit of time taking a walk by the beach or in the mountains or in the woods or in your neighborhood, in a place that you love, and think about why you want to give. What is it that makes you get out of bed in the morning and say, of all the things I could do with my money, I want to write a check to an organization? Why is that? And then jot those notes down on a napkin, in your notebook, wherever. And then go find somebody to talk about that with and ask them to send you an email in a week or a month and ask you what you've done to get closer to doing what you want to do and why you want to give. Because when someone reaches out to hold you accountable, you tend to take a step in that direction. And getting going is half the battle, I find.
That's great advice. And that person to email you can be anybody, your friend, your colleague, but you're right. Just holding yourself accountable and knowing that somebody else is going to be asking you makes a huge difference, I think. Thank you so much, Erin and Teresa, for today's conversation. I think it's been really fascinating. Thank you to our guests with your questions. We really appreciate that. As I did mention, we'll post a link to the session sometime this week. And then also wanted to give you advance notice that we'll be having our quarterly client call on May 18th. So invitations for that call will be going out sometime this week. So again, thank you everybody for spending the hour with us. It was a real pleasure. And thank you again to Teresa and Erin. Have a great night, everybody.